Thank you. What an honor. Professor Angela Davis needs no introduction. If you have thought at all about injustice or the structures of power that shape our world, there is little doubt that you've encountered her work. Still, let me say a few words about her extraordinary career, spanning decades of scholarship and activism. Ronald Reagan, former California governor at the time, and then later US president, once vowed that Angela Davis would never again teach at the University of California due to her affiliations with the Communist Party, USA. Today, she is Distinguished Professor Emerita in History of Consciousness and Feminist Studies at the University of California, Santa Cruz. And in her work, Angela Davis not only draws from her academic background and decades of activism, critical thinking, and structural analysis, she is also motivated by lived experiences. As an African-American woman raised in then the most segregated city of the South, Birmingham, Alabama, as a radical barred from employment due to her political beliefs, and as one of the millions of African-American people to spend time in prison in the US at any given time. Davis's early scholarship, including the famous Women, Race, and Class, was described by Joe James, editor of the Angela Davis Reader, as presenting a corrective to feminist theory that erased racist violence and to anti-racist theory that masked sexist violence. Prior to her arrest in 1970, Angela Davis was considered so dangerous that the FBI had her placed on the Bureau's 10 most wanted list. And upon her arrest, President Richard Nixon congratulated the FBI on its capture of the dangerous terrorist, Angela Davis. After a year and a half of imprisonment and trial, the political prisoner Angela Davis was found not guilty of the charges of conspiracy, kidnapping, and murder. The verdict followed a massive public campaign, which involved the Committee of Black People in Defense of Angela Davis, hundreds of grassroots communities across the US and in other countries, John Lennon, Yoko Ono, and the Rolling Stones, just to name a few. In an interview with Morgunblaðið last weekend, Davis reminds us that she has this national and international solidarity to thank for her liberation. The message being that by joining forces, the impossible can become possible. Redefining the US criminal justice system as a prison industrial complex, Angela Davis urges us to think seriously about the future possibility of a world without prisons. What would it look like? How would our political debates on social issues change? And if I may add, what would it mean for MeToo? If we separated it not only from criminal justice in itself, but also from the language of criminal justice, language that is so pervasive in our culture that we can barely talk about sexual harassment and violence without referring to it. Dear guests, from state-sponsored sexism in prisons to the persistent sexism in leftist grassroots organizations, from the racial realities of the segregated South to the racial tensions in feminist movements, from grassroots activism to the academic ivory tower, you might say that Angela Davis has seen it all. A militant intellectual, she's the author of 10 books and a veteran of 6 decades of activism and critical resistance. Now, speaking in Reykjavik for the first time, please welcome Professor Angela Davis.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for the wonderful introduction, Halla. And I want you to know that I am humbled and honored to have been invited to participate in this international conference of Nordic ministers hosted by Prime Minister Katrín Jakobsdóttir. Is that a correct pronunciation? This conference on the current implications of the MeToo movement. I have immensely enjoyed all of the presentations thus far and the very powerful poetry. Thank you so much, Justina. And I look forward to tomorrow's and Thursday's sessions. I am really happy to be here in Iceland at this political moment, especially considering the grave political predicament in the United States, on which I will not elaborate, and the unfortunate entanglement of public figures in the very issues this conference is considering. Women have been saying Me Too for a very long time. So long that we should have recognized long ago that gender violence and sexual harassment are structural, deeply embedded in cultures, traditions, and institutions. But it was not until 2 years ago, 2017, that these issues began to be taken seriously within the mainstream. When we began to forcefully speak out against the physical and sexual abuse of women, we did not know that it would be 50 years before this ideological struggle against gender violence would begin to yield material results. 50 years of anti-rape hotlines and other measures, 50 years of battered women's shelters, 50 years of activist commitment, protests, marches, demonstrations. Neither did we realize that it would take just as long before racist police violence would be acknowledged. Nevertheless, it is important today to acknowledge the fact that solidarity and struggle does eventually yield change. The Me Too movement is a stunning example. We are here in Iceland, this beautiful country. Iceland, which has a long history of taking the lead in struggles for women's equality. You should know that I am old enough to remember when we rejoiced around the world, having learned that Icelandic women were showing us all how we should have observed the UN-declared International Women's Year in 1975. When the majority of women here in Iceland went out on strike, they were demonstrating to the world that movements could initiate processes of structural transformation. While Icelandic women began quickly to demand increased economic, political, and educational access, the UN had to extend the Year of Women to the Decade of Women. And by the time this decade culminated in 1985 with an international women's conference and non-governmental gathering in Nairobi, Kenya, which I had the opportunity to attend, it had become apparent that we were just beginning to acknowledge the plethora of challenges facing women and their societies that would have to be confronted in order to to begin to move in the direction of gender equality. And so here we are, more than 3 decades after the conclusion of the decade of women. Perhaps the UN should have declared the century of women. And while many changes have taken place, and I think it's extremely important to acknowledge those changes, because solidarity and struggles do eventually make a difference. While many changes have taken place, gender violence remains a worldwide pandemic. That Iceland has retained first place for the last 10 years in the World Economic Forum's Global Gender Gap Index is not only a source of obvious pride for this country, but also an indication that women's movements in other countries might greatly benefit from following Iceland's lead. And the other Nordic countries, I think all of the Nordic, a few of them, not all of them, are also in the top 10 of the World Economic Forum's Gender Gap Index. Iceland is number 1, and do you know where the US is? Well, actually, it's not as bad as I thought. It's number 51 out of 149 countries. But I want to talk for a moment about that disparity, because I think the disparity has a great deal to do with, in the US, the collapse of social services that came as a result of the impact of global capitalism, especially beginning in the 80s, and the rise of neoliberal assumptions consigning what ought to be social responsibilities to the realm of the individual. As has been repeatedly emphasized here in Iceland and elsewhere in the Nordic countries, the insistence on subsidized childcare and parental leave has gone a long way toward enabling women's economic and political participation. Not coincidentally, Iceland has one of the lowest incarceration rates in the world. Well, as you know, the US has the highest. You may not be aware of the fact that 1/3 of all women who are incarcerated in the world, on this planet, are incarcerated in jails and prisons inside the US. As you will see, I want to place emphasis as feminist approaches, as intersectional feminist approaches urge us to do, on connections among different social problems such as gender violence in intimate and more public relationships, and state violence in institutions such as the prison. The example of Iceland and the other Nordic countries is important, also because it helps us understand connections and interrelationalities, but also because it warns us of the dangers of reductionism. That is to assume that closing economic, educational, and political gender gaps will necessarily and automatically lead to a reduction in the level of sexual harassment and gender violence. Thus, the importance of this conference. In the context of significant economic, political, and educational advances by women, how does one move toward minimizing the consequences of long cultural traditions of male superiority that most dramatically express themselves in terms of violence? Physical, psychological, verbal violence. As important as it may be to dismantle economic and political structures that promote gender inequality, it is also equally important to break down ideological and cultural structures that legitimize gender violence and sexual harassment in intimate as well as in economic and other public or quasi-public relationships. For example, violence is as deeply embedded in domestic work as it is in the institution of marriage. If we neglect this ideological struggle, putative advances for women may serve to strengthen the very structures that promote male supremacy, which so often also promote white supremacy. As Dean Spade and Sarah Lazar point out in their article on women and the military-industrial complex, although women now run 4 out of the 5 largest US corporations associated with the military-industrial complex, Northrop Grumman, Boeing Defense, Lockheed Martin, General Dynamics, women are in charge of the military-industrial complex now. And they're also, of course, in key positions in the governmental defense hierarchy. But is this cause for celebration? Is there anybody here who would celebrate these advances? Simply incorporating women into positions of power does not guarantee gender equality or justice in the larger sense. And I think this is a maxim we should not forget. Because we are often primed to celebrate the individual advancements of women or people of color without taking into consideration that diversity by itself may simply mean that previously marginalized individuals have been recruited to guarantee a more efficient operation of oppressive systems. As Cynthia Enlow, who is going to be speaking later in the conference, observed, there is no evidence that I've seen of the CIA, Defense Department, or other institutions where only a few women are rising to the top, that they challenge the mission of the company or the organization. Placing women in control of institutions of state violence has certainly not helped to reduce the incidence of gender violence, neither within the military nor within the larger world. Usual conceptions simply ask how to achieve diversity and inclusion without ever attending to the transformations that would be necessary in order to achieve justice. Should Black people be included in a society that remains just as racist as it was before we were invited to join? Should women be invited into a world that remains as sexist and misogynist as before? Should disabled people be embraced by a society that continues to perpetrate its ableist ideologies and practices? Gender violence is the most pandemic form of violence in the world. And the question we're being asked to ponder during this conference is, why have advances occurred in other realms while gender violence has remained unchanged? One of the answers, I think, resides in the tendency to individualize the problem. because we are led to focus primary attention on individual perpetrators as if they themselves are the beginning and end of these violences, we are rarely called upon to reflect on the structural and institutional underpinnings of these violences. And this is an instance where we might learn from struggles against racism, that we might learn that remaining at the level of the individual will condemn us to endless repetition of the same solutions, putative solutions. Repetition of legal and other proceedings on the individual level that are actually predicated on the impossibility of purging our societies of sexual harassment and assault. And so I'd like to suggest that we need to forge ways of thinking and talking about these modes of violence, the verbal and physical, psychological forms of violence that do not affirm their permanence. These violences can be ended. We should not have to assume that racist violence, which has such a long history in North America and every place that has been touched by colonialism and slavery, we should not have to assume that it is a future inevitability. We should not have to assume that women, including Black women, indigenous women, disabled women, trans women, and all of the identities that might be embraced by the category women, we should not have to assume that they will forever be the targets of gender-based violence. We should not have to assume that intimate violence, child abuse, incest will forever be associated with the form of collectivity we call the family. In the US, we should not have to assume that the proliferation of guns, over 300 million guns in the hands of civilians, along with, of course, other modes of violence, police violence, gang violence, school shootings, community violence. We should not have to assume that these will forever serve as defining features of our communities. And racist, gender, family, community violences are deeply connected to the violence of the state, to repressive apparatuses such as structures of policing, institutions of punishment, and machineries of intelligence and war. I have evoked the last period, the period of the last 50 years, during which anti-violence activism has been a significant dimension of women's movements. In the US, the anti-violence movement is most frequently periodized in connection with the 1966 founding of the National Organization of Women and the creation within that context of a task force on rape. Without wanting to minimize the important work that the National Organization for Women now has done over the years, and without wanting to undermine the eventual emergence of a very strong anti-rape and anti-violence movement, I do want to trouble this genealogy. Just as we've had to trouble the more recent genealogy of MeToo. Because as you know, Tarana Burke began using the phrase in 2006 to emphasize the pandemic dimensions of sexual violence. But it was Elisa Milano who was initially credited with the creation of the concept. And unfortunately, many contemporary images associated with MeToo are overwhelmingly white. Genealogies should always be questioned, because there's always an unacknowledged reason for beginning at a certain moment in history as opposed to another. Much of the early work of Black feminism and radical women of color feminism consisted of attempts to correct the historical record, pointing out that white women were not the only women who challenged misogyny and patriarchy, and that oftentimes women of color engaged these challenges in a more complex intersectional way. Looking at the genealogy of the anti-violence movement, one should question why the work against rape and sexual violence within the U.S. Southern Black freedom movement came to be so marginalized, so much so that it required years of research and activism to recognize, for example, Rosa Parks and the role that she played in anti-rape activism. Many people only know her as the figure who refused to move to the back of the bus. But she had already a very long history of involvement in important anti-racist activism, including in the case of the Scottsboro Nine, Recy Taylor, specifically Recy Taylor, a 1944 case in which a Black woman in a town called Abbeville, Alabama, was gang raped by a group of young white men. And then, of course, a decade later, there's the case of Emmett Till in Money, Mississippi, who was accused of making sexual comments to a white woman, and he was killed as a result. But what's interesting is that during that period, there were connections between the defense of Black women against rape and the protests of the racist use of the rape charge. In cases like the Scottsboro Nine, for example, as many scholars and activists have observed, the struggle to defend Black men from fraudulent rape charges was directly linked to the defense of Black women who were targets of rape. Rape and the racist manipulation of the rape charge were directly connected. When second wave women's movements emerged during the late 1960s in the United States, the catalyst was precisely the recognition of the ubiquity of this physical and sexual abuse of women. Although this form of violence has always crossed borders of race and class, the speak-outs and consciousness-raising sessions that attempted to break the silence regarding rape and domestic violence were primarily associated with white feminism, the strategy consisting of encouraging women to reveal violence within intimate relationships that they had previously kept secret. These new efforts to break the silence were absolutely necessary. But it was also true that Black women had forged modes of revealing this violence and creating communities within which one could acknowledge the existence of gender violence. This can be found, for example, throughout women's blues. Some years ago, I wrote a book entitled Blues, Legacies, and Black Feminism, and I argue that the second wave feminist insistence on naming intimate violence and abuse as against maintaining the silence that legitimized gender violence are preceded historically by blues women's fearless acknowledgement of domestic abuse. And I'm referring to women like Ma Rainey and Bessie Smith, and those of you who may be familiar with women's blues. While this naming of abuse within blues songs may not have led to a political change or a change in real life, it did nevertheless help to create a terrain on which present-day political consciousness around gender violence could grow and develop. I'd like to pose a question. How does our view of gender violence change if we look at it from the vantage point of Black women or indigenous women or working class and poor women of all racial backgrounds? And by way of beginning to formulate an answer to this question, I would say that we would have to be critical of the way in which middle-class white women have come to stand in for all survivors of violence. Because of the assumed privatization of the lives of middle-class white women, because, of course, the private sphere is supposed to be a haven of freedom. Catherine McKinnon and other feminist scholars have examined these contradictions. Repressive apparatuses can be called upon to secure that freedom. Thus, gender violence comes to be represented as a problem to be solved by state violence, by police and prisons. This does not work for those who are not acknowledged as subjects of freedom in the private sphere. We've already experienced the contradictions of guaranteeing abortion rights to women by virtue of protecting their privacy and the private relationship between them and their doctors. What about those women who have no doctors, who have no privacy to protect? An analysis that does not explore the structural basis of violence can very easily rely on carceral methods to address gender violence. This is why those of us who identify with what we have come to call abolition feminism, that is to say, abolition and transformation of institutions of incarceration and policing, this is why we refer to the strategies of reliance on these institutions to solve the problem of gender violence as carceral feminism. Carceral feminism is a term that has emerged to refer to a feminism that relies on criminalization, that therefore assists in the buildup of prisons, that even if inadvertently bolsters the structural racism which is most dramatically seen in the prisons of the world, which hold a disproportionate number of Black and Latinx people, of indigenous people, people from the global South, migrants. When we first raised the call for abolition, and this is many decades ago, there were those who argued that precisely at a time when we had just succeeded in having domestic violence and sexual assault recognized as crimes, we were calling for an abolition of the system that would make male purveyors of violence against women accountable. But now, can we not ask whether it is not now time to think about more effective ways of ridding the world of gender violence and other products of what we have come to call toxic masculinities? Is it not now time that men began to take the leadership in the campaign to redefine masculinity and to disarticulate it from violence and subjection? It is true that women are on the rise throughout the world. And I think we're all very happy about that. That when women rise up, that means that the world can change. But women cannot simply aspire to take the places of men. And too often we assume that the structures can remain intact, and simply by placing women in positions previously occupied by men, the world will change. But I have news for you. It will remain exactly the same as before. If we simply want to become what white, straight, cis, powerful men have been in the past, we are replicating the heteropatriarchal structures that will continue to perpetrate the violence we think we are challenging. This is the dilemma of glass ceiling feminism. And I won't say more than that. But I will say that if we don't challenge the structures, if we don't challenge the very meaning of hierarchies of power, we will be in a position where women, it might be said that women are fighting for the right to be as violent as men. And that would make no sense at all. This is why campaigns demanding the equality of women in the military should always be combined with a deep critique of the military itself. And I feel wonderful to spend some days in a country that has no standing army. And that is what justice would mean, the dismantling of militarism altogether. But this is why marriage equality with respect to LGBTQ communities should always be combined with a radical critique of the institution of marriage, which is grounded in capitalist notions of property inheritance, but also structurally harbors the very violence we oppose when we say we are standing up against gender violence. Our work for reproductive rights needs not only to emphasize the defense of abortion rights, the much needed defense of abortion rights, but also freedom from sterilization abuse and the many other aspects of reproductive justice. Our critique of gender violence is most effective when it is linked to a critique of racist violence. Even in communities that think of themselves as homogeneous, racially homogeneous. The legacies of the violences that enable slavery and colonialism are sedimented in heteropatriarchal violence today, whether the perpetrators are white or black or brown. In her book on Dutch racism, entitled White Innocence, Paradoxes of Colonialism and Race, Gloria Wekke has this to say about the Netherlands. We are a small nation, innocent. We are inherently anti-racist. Moreover, we do not have bad intentions. And as she emphasizes, this sense of the national self in the Netherlands is generated by a society that, and I'm quoting from her book, that has managed to convince itself that nearly 400 years of colonialism have miraculously not left any traces of racism, either in the culture, history, language, representations of the self, and the other, or in institutions. What characterizes the progress we have made in the last decades with respect to racism is an understanding of the structural nature of racism and its intersectional relation to misogyny and heteropatriarchy. We have learned that we cannot simply call for the prosecution of police officers while leaving the institution of policing intact. Thus, the individual perpetrators of harassment in the workplace, for example, cannot simply be called to answer as individuals, leaving the enabling dimensions of the workplace intact. While perpetrators certainly need to be held accountable, punitive approaches will not solve the structural problem. So how do we engage in massive projects of what you might call ideological critique and critical education, critical mass education? You know, I've been thinking about how it was possible to eliminate smoking in public places. And the fact that when we first began to protest gender violence, many of us were serious smokers. And I always cringe when I see myself in documentaries like chain smoking. But it's interesting that within a relatively short period of time, as a result of coordinated campaigns, media campaigns, peer-driven campaigns, governmental campaigns, smoking has become very rare. So what if the same efforts were exerted in relation to verbal and physical violence against women? We need positive approaches. Feminism that moves us forward recognizes that punitive approaches rarely work. More jails and prisons have led to the greater permanence of these carceral modes of punishment and to the spread of carcerality in everyday life from Palestine to the United States. As a matter of fact, in the US, we have learned a great deal from Palestinian resistors, intellectuals, and activists about how to challenge racism in the US. In fact, Black Lives Matter and the larger movement for Black lives, which seeks also to demand gender violence, has learned a great deal from their solidarity relations with Palestine. And I also want to mention the Rohingya and the systematic use of rape against the Rohingya people. I don't think we question now the structural character of gender violence. But I do wonder whether we believe that we can really eradicate it. particularly since it is so deeply embedded in our histories and cultures and traditions. And I want to say that I do believe that we can contribute to the eradication of sexual harassment and violence, but there are no instant solutions. And oftentimes we follow capitalism in its search for immediate answers, and we use the fast food example that we want it and then we have to have it in 10 minutes or 1 minute or next year or 5 years. You know, there's like the 5-year outcome. I don't know how many of you've written grants and you're asked what is the 5-year outcome. We have to recognize that this will be a protracted struggle. But I also believe that we need to engage in the kind of research and activism that generates an urgency, that generates the kind of urgency that persuades us that we can indeed purge our worlds of these violences. I totally agree with Prime Minister Katrín. Her sons and members of the younger generation are making and will make a difference. Young people have already organized the global climate strike, which begins on September 20th. They know that saving the planet is the very precondition of their future. Girls, trans children, boys want a different gender environment as well. It is also a precondition of their future, and it is our responsibility to follow their lead. Thank you.